Okay, Thomas Jefferson, part 3 of 3. Foreign affairs. As a matter of policy and principle, Jefferson tried to continue to embrace the precedent set by Washington and remain neutral. However, this policy was tested by both the French and the British during the Napoleonic Wars. But one of the first challenges to this policy didn't actually come from France or Britain, but from the Barbary states, which, as you can see kind of on this OK map, is on the northern and western coasts of Africa. So this is Algeria, Tunisia, Canary Islands, etc. Now, both Washington and Adams agreed to pay tribute, or really bribes, to these Barbary pirates to avoid them seizing U.S. merchant ships. But during Jefferson's presidency, when the Pasha of Tripoli demands a higher sum, like more money, a bigger bribe, Thomas Jefferson says no way. And he sends a very small fleet of the U.S. Navy to the Mediterranean. There's intermittent fighting between 1801 and 1805 when eventually a treaty was signed. The U.S. agreed to pay $60,000, which was the ransom payments for captured Americans at the time. But it's important to remember that Jefferson, who was staunchly against the formation of the Navy and definitely against the United States' use of military power, again, strong national government, here uses the Navy during his own presidency. The belligerent nations of Nation and France, and again, you're going to hear this term quite a bit if you're not familiar with what belligerent nations are. Those are nations that are engaging in military combat or are hostile towards one another. So Britain and France are definitely belligerent nations during this time period, and they begin blockading the ports of their enemy. And not only does this interfere with U.S. trade, but the British, they're both seizing U.S. ships and their cargo. Since Britain had the largest navy, the U.S. perceived them as a bigger threat. Plus, the British were also known to capture U.S. sailors and impress them into servitude in the British Navy. The British, in all of their audacity, claimed that the U.S. soldiers were actually British citizens, completely refusing to recognize the sovereignty of the United States citizens. This came to a head in the Chesapeake Leopard Affair in 1807. So this happened off the coast of Virginia, and it only served to increase American ire towards the British. What happens is the British warship Leopard opened fire on the U.S. warship Chesapeake. 3 Americans were killed, and 4 others were captured and impressed into the British Navy. The Americans experience, or America experiences, this really heavy anti-British attitude as a result of this event. And many Americans urge President Thomas Jefferson to ask for a declaration of war. But as an alternative to war, Jefferson persuades the Democratic, Republican, and majority to pass the Embargo Act of 1807. And this prohibits American ships from sailing to any foreign port. Now, unlike a blockade, which is the closing of forts closing of ports by military force of another nation, so when one nation forcibly closes the ports of another nation, and that's usually seen as an act of war, an embargo is a nation's decision about its own trade in order to protect its interests. So, an embargo, again, is when Thomas Jefferson said it is no longer allowed for American ships to go and sail to foreign ports. The reason he did this is because the British at the time were the U.S.'s largest trading partner, and Jefferson hoped that this legislation would put the squeeze on Britain and force them to agree to stop seizing American ships and taking U.S. citizens. without having to go to war. Unfortunately, the plan backfires big time. The British just go further south on the map and they go trade with South America and buy those goods. Meanwhile, the embargo completely devastates the U.S. economy. Hurt particularly hard were the merchant marines and shipbuilders of New England. Admitting defeat, Jefferson calls for a repeal of the act in 1809 in the last days of his presidency. After the repeal, the United States could trade legally with anybody except Britain and France. Here we see a popular political cartoon from 1813. I want you to take a look at the title of this political cartoon. There are two titles to this cartoon, and I want you to analyze it. I want you to take a look at how this cartoon represents American feelings at the time. I want you to record this in your notes because we're going to discuss it next class. So whenever you're looking at political cartoons, I like to start with just a basic what is happening in this cartoon, okay? So you have a guy who's carrying a barrel and a snapping turtle is biting his leg, and there's someone behind the snapping turtle and both of them are saying two things, etc. Okay, so you guys can do that on your own. Feel free to pause it here for a second before moving on. Oh man, that's an ugly slide. Okay, so in closing, Thomas Jefferson's presidency is a great example of the intricacies of historical figures. It's easy to try to box people in to a certain characteristic or ideal when we're looking at people through a historical lens. But it's important to remember that people then are just as multifaceted as people now. Does Jefferson's presidency uphold his earlier democratic principles? Is this a bad thing for a president to change their views? These are questions that you're going to have to answer not only as a historian, but as a citizen, and you'll have plenty of opportunity to practice coming to those conclusions as the course carries on. So this concludes our discussion on Thomas Jefferson. Our next video series will be about James Madison. Because I'm an excellent history teacher, of course I included sources of my work. Have a great day.